It's Tim Derling. This is Tim's Vinyl Confessions. Thanks for tuning in. You can tell right away this is being filmed in a different spot. It is. Sarah and I are on vacation in lovely Surrey, Prince Edward Island, and you'll be watching this much later than this was actually filmed. It's a gorgeous sunny day in July, but right now, no matter when you watch this, it's probably nicer in Cabo, which is a lame segue into telling you that this episode's about my Sammy Hagar CD collection as far as his solo stuff goes. His early solo catalog, back when I was just buying tapes, long before the internet, was second only to Y&T in hardest to complete. They were not successful albums, and you found a lot of record company compilations that were just kind of cheaply made, thrown out, and it wasn't until much, much later that I was able to complete them. And then when CDs came out, it was a little bit easier, but some of them were still difficult to locate. So some of these CDs fall into the category of ones I'd never have to try and look for again. I'm gonna go over what I've got here. So Sammy Hagar did 2 albums with Montrose. His first solo album came out in 1976, 9 on a 10 scale. He obviously liked that phrase because 12 years later he would use it in the lyric to the song Sucker in a 3-piece from Van Halen's OU812 album. But anyway, first thing you'll notice is that other than the writing, which I don't think appeared on the original album cover, I don't have it in front of me to compare, there's no red on here, which is odd, but that came later. This is a reissued CD from a British company called BGO, or Beat Goes On Records, who did a lot of reissues. And these ones were most welcome because they were issued on CD by Capitol Records in the 80s, but they were deleted probably not long after they were issued, along with the cassettes. Very hard to find. Now this first album, there's a lot of covers on this album, a lot of material supplied by other artists. It's not necessarily all Hagar originals. There's a song on here called Flamingos Fly, which Van Morrison wrote. A song here called China, which is written by Bob Welch. So it really wasn't, it was a mixed bag of songs, and it really wasn't him showing what he was wanting to do, which is a harder rock approach. Actually, all of his early albums are quite varied. They do a pretty good job of reprinting all the original credits. So his second album came out in '77. It was originally self-titled when it came out, but most fans refer to it as the Red Album for obvious reasons. Just about everything on this album cover is red. Like just about everything, if you were to look at that. And also this is the album that contained a song called Red, which Sammy's an interesting guy. He's obsessed with the color red, the number 9. He's a numerologist. He's an interesting guy, but so it was with this album that people started referring to him as the Red Rocker. This again is another BGO issue. It's even called Red there on the side, but it doesn't say Red anywhere on the record, cassette, or CD. It's just a nickname, much like Metallica's Black Album. So these ones, they were reissued in 1993. So up until then, you were basically, you know, you might find it on cassette. I didn't actually. I think the first time I had this was on record, like 95. From the inner sleeve in black and white, though, the way they reprinted it, that's all right, and credits. The main thing was getting these albums. Third album also came out in 1977. He was quite prolific at this point. He'd cut his hair at this point because there were some criticisms. They were comparing him to like the likes of Robert Plant and Roger Daltrey, and though he was a fan of those artists, he was all American. That's always been his thing. So he cut his hair. This is a very different look for him, and this album's called Musical Chairs. I'm not sure if Hypnosis designed this album cover, but it certainly looks like it. It's very English looking, oddly enough. This is another BGO issue, but this came out in '94, and there's a little bit more work gone into it, so they're incorporating the artwork from the back cover. Here it is. He's teaching his band karate. I don't know what to say about that, but there it is. And the CDs all kind of look the same. Now, there's no information on here on what this is, but if I had the record in front of me, I could tell you this definitely looks like a Hypnosis sleeve or one that's trying to copy that. There's an interesting story with Sammy Hagar's 1978 live album. It was originally called All Night Long, and it was reissued in the UK under the title Loud and Clear. And we'll get to that, but because of that, the All Night Long album was not issued by BGO, so it took me a little bit longer to find that one. I eventually did find it A company called One Way Records, who specialized in reissues, put this out in 1996. This is one of my all-time favorite live albums. There's no big songs on this. It's got a little bit of his mantra stuff, but if you're a fan of early Sammy Hagar, but you don't really like the way that the studio tracks sound, very similar to the early Whitesnake. If you like the songs, think they're kind of tame sounding, maybe a little dated production, listen to Live in the Heart of the City. That's a very common theme in the 70s and up till 1980 with studio production versus live. This is just a great album, lots of energy. And I was glad to see this one on CD. So One Way Records, there's the Arrow logo. This was recorded as he was opening, I think he opened for Boston for a long period of time, I want to say almost 2 years. So got in front of a lot of fans, wasn't selling a lot of albums at that point. Reprinting the back cover there. And these reissues, that's the inner sleeve, that photo there. So they kind of did a little bit more as far as presenting the albums. The next studio album to come out was the '79. It's called Street Machine. Another very red album cover, back to the regular red look. This is a BGO reissue from '92, actually. This has the song called Trans Am, Highway Wonderland. Obviously, he loves cars, too. And the songwriting credits there. And there's no other credits in here, but there is a picture of the inner sleeve. He's a sci-fi guy, too. He's, way into aliens. He's got the Starship Enterprise on his shirt there. I highly recommend you read Sammy's autobiography called Red. There's a lot more to him than the guy that sang with Van Halen for a few years. So, I mentioned that his live album, All Night Long, was not issued in the UK. It was issued in the UK in '79, but they gave it a different title and a different cover. It was called Loud and Clear, so of course I had to get this one too. Now this is a BGO reissue, but it's a much more recent one. It's from 2010. It actually came with a slipcase. And it's got the exact same track listing that's on the CD, except for the fact that they added a live version of Space Station No. 5, which is one of the tracks from the first Montrose album. It's not the same version that appears on the live 1980. It's different, so it's unique to get it on this. First time I've ever heard this exact live version. Well done reissue campaign, really. And this one has, inside the tray, here's the other albums that are available. And the CD looks a little bit different. And it's actually got a pretty extended, it's got all the credits reprinted here. And it's got a new write-up on it as of 2010. So this was cool to get. So Sammy did all these albums for Capitol. He was, coughing out an album a year, sometimes more. None of them really, he had a couple songs that charted in the lower reaches of the top 100. I mean, one of them was a cover of Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. The other one was a really mellow song called You Make Me Crazy. Like, he just wasn't making it as a solo artist. His final album to come out on Capitol Records came out in 1980. It was called Danger Zone. And this is a BGO reissue from 1995. And you could tell the later ones, they're just putting more into it. What I always thought was cool about Sammy is that even though he was billed as a solo artist, he always had pictures of him and his whole band. Bryan Adams did that too, or still does that. And this has a little bit of a write-up too. So, 1980 into 1981, Sammy switches to Geffen Records, which at the time was a relatively new record label. Only two other artists, I believe, signed to Geffen before him. And they were no less than John Lennon, before he died, and Donna Summer, who was one of the biggest stars in the world at the time. So Sammy was number 3. And although, he never scaled those heights as a solo artist, he did have his most successful period with Geffen, and the only songs that most people would know by Sammy as a solo artist are from these years. So the first album that came out on Geffen was 1981, Standing Hampton, which I always thought was an odd album cover and an odd title. Let me explain what the title means. Hampton is British slang for part of the male anatomy, okay, Hampton. So you can ascertain that a standing Hampton would be, all right, so this is a CD. That's what it looks like on the side. And this is a slightly newer, yeah, this is a slightly newer version of the CD because Geffen has a MCA distribution on it as opposed to Warner Brothers distribution, which happened turn of 1990 into 1991. Even though it still looks like the Warner produced CDs, they just changed the little stamp that they put on it. So this has all the lyrics and credits that the record had. The cassette did not have lyrics. And this was his first, it was a gold album initially, and eventually it went platinum. And I'll Fall in Love Again was almost a top 40 single. It bowed out at number 43. Song There's Only One Way to Rock was a concert anthem for him, and it even became a concert anthem in his Van Halen years. Oftentimes they would open with the song. If you've ever seen the Live Without a Net home video they did in the 5150 tour, he and Eddie trade off solos. It's the first time I ever heard the song. I thought it was a Van Halen song before I had all the albums. And another song that it's interesting, given shows you where my age was. So I got this in '89, so I was 15. I didn't realize the last song on this album was a cover. It was a little song called Piece of My Heart. Yes, the Janis Joplin song. This one hit the top 100. First time I ever heard it or heard of it was here. And another song that's notable on here is the song Heavy Metal, which he co-wrote with Jim Peterick of Survivor. And that song appeared on this movie of the same name, the animated film Heavy Metal. So this album was a pretty significant album for him and kind of, well, it was his first big album, his first successful one by any stretch of the imagination. Incidentally, the I'll Fall in Love Again, the 45 of that, and I've gone over this on my vinyl episode. B-side's a great little tune called Satisfied. It's a rocking song. Never appeared on CD anywhere. I wish they would reissue it, this CD, put that on it. Maybe they will someday. It's never been on any of his compilations. I don't know why. And so I mentioned how hard the Capitol Records albums were to get. Now he switched to Geffen, but every record company does this. An artist switches labels, so then their previous label has to cough out some sort of compilation or something to try to cash in on that success. And Capitol did it many, many times. Many, many times. The first time was in 1982. They put out an album called Rematch, which was a best of, but it wasn't marketed to look like a best of. It was supposed to look like a new album. So I don't know how many people they thought they were fooling with that. But this actually is the only CD I have from his Capitol albums on Capitol. This is a rare CD. This actually came out in 1987 under the title Rematch and More. This little and more did not appear in the initial record and cassette. This is a very rare CD. That's what Capitol CDs looked like in the 80s. And there's actually 15 songs in here. The original album only had 10. And this on the back here says CD Extra Tracks Pack. So they were really touting the fact that CDs held more than vinyl. And the only other CD I've ever seen this on is another rare Capitol CD I have is Queen's a Kind of Magic. It's got this on it too. There's the CD itself. And it's just got the songwriting credits. Doesn't say anything about where the albums came from or anything like that. So also in 1982 was Sammy's second Geffen album, and maybe my favorite of his solo albums, 3 Lockbox. Love this album a lot. This was a gold album for him, and oddly enough, it contained his most successful single as a solo artist. A lot of people would probably think that's I Can't Drive 55, but it's not. It's Your Love Is Driving Me Crazy, which got to number 13, and that came from here. This is a really good album. The title song was his very first actual video. And this is an earlier Geffen CD because it's Warner distribution. Back cover reprinted here. And on the inside, it's got the credits. There wasn't a lot of credits to begin with, and then it's got notes, which all the Warner Music labels had these little notes things when they first put out their initial run of reissued CDs. So 1983, Capitol strikes again, this time with some more live material, which I'm welcome to. This was recorded in 1980 at the Hammersmith Odeon in the UK, where he did a little bit better as a solo artist than he did in the States, at least with his early material. Live 1980. Now this is a one-way records reissue. The original record and cassette and the original Capitol CD did not have this pink border. I don't know why they decided to put that on there. This is another good live album and better versions of these songs. It's a perfect companion piece to All Night Long. It's a cool shot of the curtain right before the curtain's about to drop. So you can tell he was playing some pretty big size places there in the UK. The Montrose album was always very well revered in there. And as a matter of fact, it wouldn't surprise me if he recorded this in 1980 in the UK. His opening band was probably a very young Def Leppard. Timeline-wise, that would make sense. So 1984, there's two albums here to talk about, both on Geffen Records. The first one was just kind of put out there and forgotten about. I'm including it in his solo section because this band never did anything else. So this is HSAS, and the album's called Through the Fire. HSAS stands for Hagar, Schoen, Aronson, and Shreve. Now you can ascertain, yes, that's Neil Schon from Journey. Kenny Aronson was a bass player from, at the time, he was playing with Billy Squier. I'm not sure what the rest of his background was, and Shreve is Michael Shreve on drums, who, like Neil Schon, is an alumnus of Santana. So they did this quick little tour, like a 9-city tour around like probably this California and the Bay Area, and recorded all these new songs, took the audience out on the tapes and put it out as this album. So there wasn't a lot of promotion done by the label. Geffen's not going to promote it because they've got him as a solo artist. So what's this? I mean, it could have been just a solo album. And probably Columbia Records said, hey, you know, you've got our guitar player over here. You know, he belongs to us. Anyway, whatever the case, I didn't find this on CD until they reissued it in 1997. It took me years before I even found it on cassette. It's got some interesting material on it. They actually charted a top 100 single, not much of a hit. I think it got to number 94 when they covered Procol Harum's Whiter Shade of Pale. So that's a shot there. Let's see now. Doesn't say much except for who's on it. There's, you can go on YouTube and type in HSAS 1984, and there's actually some other songs that they did live that didn't end up on here. One of them was called The Love, which Sammy did many, many years later on his Red Voodoo album. Yes, it says this album was recorded live by the Westwood One Mobile Facility, November 9th to 21st, 1983. So they did it really quickly, and they put it out, and it was almost instantly deleted. So then they put it out again. 1984 was the release, though, of his biggest solo album as a solo artist, VOA, which stands for Voice of America. There he is parachuting in front of the White House to take care of things, I guess. This CD is a newer issue with MCA distribution. It does contain I Can't Drive 55, which is definitely his best known video and probably the song he's best known for as a solo artist, even though I think only got to like number 28 on the charts. Two Sides of Love was another top 40 single off of this one. Ted Templeman produced this album, which is interesting because Ted Templeman produced the first two Montrose albums with him. And then, of course, he produced Van Halen from their first album all the way through 1984. Then he would go on to produce David Lee Roth's Crazy from the Heat and Eat 'Em and Smile, and would reunite with Van Halen and Sammy in 1981 for my favorite Van Halen album, For a Novel Carnal Knowledge. But anyway, this is the only solo album of Sammy's that Ted Templeman produced. Surprisingly enough, for an album that came out in 1984, I always found it strange there's only 8 songs on here. That's a very 70s thing to have 8 or 9 songs on an album as opposed to 10 or 12. So, of course, we all know, most people here watching would know, in 1985, David Lee Roth out of Van Halen, they need a singer, Sammy's in. 1986, 5150 comes out. So, to get Sammy to go to Van Halen, to join Van Halen, he was contracted to Geffen Records. Van Halen were on Warner Brothers Records, and although the two labels were connected, there were a lot of things that had to be worked out, and one of the stipulations is they said, okay, he owes us, as Geffen Records, he owes us one more solo album. So in 1987, after the 5150 tour was done, this album came out. It was self-titled when it initially came out, If you have it on cassette, it's got a white cover. Doesn't look like this, but if you had the, well, I'll show you where that came from here. And this is an original Geffen CD. Now, the album eventually did have a title. It was called I Never Said Goodbye. That was an MTV contest to name the album. But by the time that contest aired, this album had already hit the stores. It was already produced, and they eventually reissued it with the title. So if you've only got it on cassette, you've probably got it with this picture on it. This had a top 40 single, Give to Live, and another song, Eagles Fly, which, like There's Only One Way to Rock, became a staple when Sammy was in Van Halen. Oftentimes he would just walk out and do that song himself on acoustic guitar. And actually, Eddie Van Halen co-produced this album and plays bass on it. Not guitar, but bass. So, the next thing I've got is Capitol Records once again put out a compilation album in 1992. This one's a little bit better done. It's not as thrown together. It's just simply called The Best of Sammy Hagar. And this is a US edition of this. It's basically it's the same as Rematch, but there is more work gone into it. There's more extensive liner notes. It mentions that he is, that writing was in Van Halen. So now we're up to 1994. By this time, things were not going well in the Van Halen camp. Again, if you read Sammy's book, you'll know that. But Sammy's first best of his Geffen years, in other words, best of songs that were actually hits, came out. It's called Unboxed. Now, Sammy was almost a boxer. His dad was a boxer. He never got into it full time, but he was like semi-pro at one point. But also, aside from the obvious reference, it was sort of like, no, I'm not doing a box set. I'm going to call this Unboxed. So this came out on Geffen Records in 1994 and was actually any money made off of this went to pay his alimony payments, if I'm understanding that correctly. It had two brand new songs on it, High Hopes and Buying My Way into Heaven. Good compilation of his Geffen years. Curiously, does not contain his biggest hit, Your Love Is Driving Me Crazy. I'm sure that was not, he probably just did that on purpose. But a good compilation, and one of the easier ones to find, actually. Some of these CDs are not easy to find at all. So, it would be another 3 years. By this time, Sammy's out of Van Halen and he resumes his solo career and puts out his first solo album, post Van Halen, called Marching to Mars, which might be my second favorite of his albums. I absolutely love this album. It's very personal, there was a lot going on, and it all came out on this album. This was on a small label called Track Records, which is distributed by MCA. Little White Lie came off this album, was the best known song. The video, kind of thumbing its nose or its finger or whatever at the Van Halen brothers. But I really enjoy this album. It's, my opinion, the best thing he's put out as a solo artist. He hasn't put anything out as a solo artist that's as good as this since then. Just my opinion. From an album all the way through. There are no lyrics in this. He had a lot of guests appear on this album. For instance, let's see. Well, Little White Lie has Huey Lewis on harmonica. This is one of those ones that are all laid out weird. Slash plays guitar on it. Eric Martin of Mr. Big sings backing vocals on a song. And one thing that's really cool in this album is a song called Leaving the Warmth of the Womb, which essentially is a Montrose reunion. So it's got Sammy, Ronnie Montrose, Bill Church, and Denny Carmassi playing on that song, which is the original Montrose lineup. I really, really like this album. After that, the albums all had some good songs on them, but he kind of went into this whole party style, like a hard rock Jimmy Buffett style, which, hey, guy's happy. That's awesome. I think that Sammy works better in a group context. I'm a huge fan of Chickenfoot. I wish they'd put out a third album. And there's another album I'm going to get to that I like as well. But I think when there's a lot of people contributing, I think there's a better album. This is the second one he put out. He was billing now as Sammy Hagar on the Wabaritas, sometimes just called the Wabos. As in Cabo Wabo, the song from OU 812, that gave the name to his club in Cabo San Lucas, and blah, 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 blah. So this came out in 1999. It's the second to last one he did on MCA Records. This is a Canadian CD. Big song off this one was called Mas Tequila. There's a write-up here he provides, and no lyrics in this, just some credits and a few pictures. Now we're getting into a period where the albums are a little bit harder to find because there was getting into some smaller labels. So in the year 2000, he puts out this album, 1013. Now 1013 is his birthday, October 13th. And this has a few good songs on it, but again, we're getting the number of really cool, memorable songs per album, my opinion, is shrinking. This is actually a Columbia House copy. It was originally on Beyond Music, which is a label that was out for a short while. Motley Crue were on that label. There was a few other acts that were on it that were on major labels. A lot of pictures in here. And yeah, a write-up in here as well. Next one, it took me a long time to find after it came out. It was on a very small label called 33rd Street Records. It took me a long time to find it, and by the time I finally got it and listened to it, I remember thinking, was it worth the search? I mean, I have to have it to complete the collection. It's called Not For Sale. 2002, and boy, I was just never got into this album. It's not that there's bad songs on it. It doesn't stand up to repeat listening. So the CD's kind of funny. It looks like a quarter. One notable song on here is called Whole Lotta Zepp, which is basically a mishmash of Whole Lotta Love and Kashmir by Zeppelin. Now that Zeppelin, that'll go a bit further here looking ahead. The next thing that he came out with I thought was actually really cool. 2003, it's a live album. First live album he's done in a while. Basically, it's called Live Hallelujah. And on this album, it's a great mix. So, you know, you can see 3 Lockbox on there, Give to Live. Top of the World, he's dipping into the Van Halen catalog. Why Can't This Be Love? Rock Candy, he's doing like Montrose on here. When It's Love, Right Now, Dreams. So, and it's a good sounding album too. I mean, he and his band, you know, they do the stuff really, really well. But what's really cool about this, this was recorded on part of it was recorded on one of the strangest tours I think that still to this date, it seems to me like it was just an elaborate prank and it never actually happened. I would have loved to have seen it. But in 2002, Sammy Hagar went on tour with David Lee Roth. And they would flip-flop headlining nights, just the weirdest thing ever, but it actually did happen. And part of this was recorded on that tour. Now, of course, Dave did not accept Sammy's invitation to come up on stage and jam. I think that would have been really cool, but having said that, on some of the songs, on When It's Love, so Mike Anthony's playing bass on, you know, by this point, most of the time with Sammy, because Van Halen are inactive and he's basically persona non grata. Mike's out of the band. So on When It's Love, you've got 3 former Van Halen members on it from different times. So you've got Sammy and Mike, who've been joined at the hip ever since pretty much. But Gary Cherone, of course, the singer from Extreme, but also sang on Van Halen 3. And on the Van Halen 3 tour, it was the only tour where there were ever songs performed from both eras of the band. So he came up and they traded off verses. Very, very cool. So 2004, that was the year Sammy briefly reunited with Van Halen. Geffen, or I guess I should say Universal, put out the Essential Red Collection. And this is a best of. This is like the definitive single disc best of for Sammy. I recommend, if you're going to get one thing from his solo career, I'd recommend this. Now, what makes this really valuable to fans is the fact that this has some of his soundtrack songs on it. And I love when artists do this. They get smart enough to realize, you know, maybe not everybody wants to buy a soundtrack. So it's got, he actually did the title song from Fast Times at Ridgemont High. It wasn't a hit, but it was on the soundtrack. That's on here. The Girl Gets Around, which is off the Footloose soundtrack. That's on here. And one of my favorite tunes of his, Winner Takes It All, from the Over the Top soundtrack with Sylvester Stallone. You got to check that video out. He and Sly Stallone have an arm wrestling match. And they're all on here, easily available. So there you go. It's a good one to get. Next thing, the next solo album he came out with, still a Sammy and the Wabos album, 2006, called Living It Up. And I really don't like this album. This is too beachy, too laid back. Yeah, I'm just not feeling this one. but I had to get it. This was on Rhino Records. Yeah, never got into that one. 2008 is actually the last time that he put an album out that's solely in his name. It's called Cosmic Universal Fashion. This album came out, it was only out a few months before the first Chickenfoot album came out, so I'm not really sure what the timeline was. This is on Roadrunner Records. Very weird credit sort of in here. Now, the title song, Cosmic Universal Fashion, is a cool song. The video to it was kind of like a sequel to the Right Now video. There are a couple of good rockers on here. It was much better than his last one. Much better than his last one. But this is what I think is dumb. If you put the CD in your computer, you're supposed to be able to have a link to all of the inside credits. Now when I put it in, it says blocked in my country. So that's dumb. Chickenfoot puts out a couple good albums, a really good debut album in 2009, a second one in 2011. In 2013, a new album came out called Sammy Hagar and Friends. And by this time, this has a little bit of that beach thing on it, but it's still better than Living It Up. This came out on Frontiers Records in 2013. He does some covers on here, so he does, you know, Personal Jesus by Depeche Mode, Neil Sean. It's almost HSAS reunion. Neil Sean's on this. Ramblin' Gamblin' Man, the old Bob Seger song, he does that. He does Jimmy Buffett's Margaritaville with Toby Keith. So some of this is getting into territory that, not for me, but you know, there are some good songs on here. There's also a DVD that came with this. There's a bonus song on here, Space Station Number 5, which is a Montrose song that came from the Ronnie Montrose tribute concert. Ronnie Montrose sadly died in 2012. So this is a worthwhile release. Next thing that happened, Chickenfoot kind of didn't stay together long, mostly because Chad Smith had prior commitments to this other band he's in. You may have heard of them, it's called the Red Hot Chili Peppers. So that kind of kept them off the, you know, from doing anything. So they formed a band, so Sammy Hagar, Michael Anthony, Jason Bonham, and Vic Johnson, who's Sammy's longtime guitar player. They're calling themselves The Circle, and they went on tour. This album is called At Your Service, and this is a good album. So check out that track listing. I did a review episode of this a long time ago. Again, like the Live Hallelujah, he's going all the way back to Montrose, his solo career, Van Halen. But now that Jason Bonham is in the group, they dip into Led Zeppelin. They do When the Levee Breaks, they do Good Times, Bad Times, Moby Dick, drum solo, of course, rock and roll. So this is just a good overall album. I don't know why they didn't film it and put it out on DVD. Maybe they'll do one yet. So the next thing I'm going to talk about, remember I was saying about how like his most recent studio albums, they just weren't connecting with me? Let's compile those songs and put them out. This is called When the Party Started. This was put out in end of 2016 on Mailboat Records. And even though that's like an 80s era photo of Sammy, this is all stuff from 1013, Not For Sale, the heck was it called? Living It Up. So basically you're compiling the best of, I think, some of his worst albums, in my opinion. So this isn't, there was one new song on it at the end, which I didn't think was all that great. So, but as a big fan, I'm a huge fan. He's one of my favorite singers ever. So I got to have the stuff. It's just not my cup of tea, some of the stuff. However, I'm happy to say I'm going to end on a good note. Just this year, Sammy Hagar and The Circle put out their very first album, and I consider it part of his solo album because, I mean, basically it is Sammy Hagar and The Circle. It's called The Space Between. I did a review episode of this a little while ago, so I'm not going to go too far into this. Still really enjoying this album. As I said, I think he works better in a group context, especially if you got a bunch of guys that want to play heavy rock. So you're not going to get the beat, I call it the beachy stuff. I think you know what I mean. So it's got these weird fold out credits here. So there you go. Curious, like, you know, is anybody out there else out there, if you got any of the old Capitol CDs, I'd love to see pictures of them. And what are your favorite of Sammy Hagar's solo albums? I thank you very much for watching this edition of Tim's Vinyl Confessions.